what happens after birth. Right? We call this postnatal development, post meaning after, natal referring to the fetal and embryonic stages, right? So we kind of have this concept of overall growth. Okay, it's predictable and consistent. However, it is not linear. Okay, so we can see the growth chart to the right is characterized by a sigmoid curve. It's a really fun word to say. Some people refer to sigmoid curves as S curves, and you can this picture doesn't really highlight the S shape very well, but you can kind of see this S-like shape, right, where we kind of have this little bit of a plateau on the top, fairly steady rate at the bottom, and then another curve at the bottom of the chart. So sigmoid curves generally are going to have some rapid increase, right? If this is time as time progresses, and we're looking at increases in overall growth, so we could think about this as height, right? And we're going to see this really rapid increase in growth after birth. And then around ages 2 or 3, kind of that's where we stop talking about growth in previous weeks. After that, usually we kind of see a pretty steady development until puberty starts to hit. So you can see 11, 12 ranges here, and the curves start to steepen in that small span of years. And then usually when we get to about the ages of 16, 17, 18, 19, kind of dependent on the individual, that's when you start to see these plateaus where growth is kind of gotten as good as it's going to get, and then people stop growing, right? There are some cases where you might see growth past puberty as a second growth spurt, but usually it's not going to be as big as your initial growth spurt when you hit puberty. Okay, so this is our sigmoid curve that kind of highlights different growth characteristics. So this applies both to height as well as weight. Postnatal development does have different characteristics or factors that can affect developmental patterns. Okay, so we could have sex differences between males and females. This factors into timing and extent of growth. So typically males have different growth characteristics than females in terms of when their growth spurts happen, how they gain weight, etc. We'll go over some more examples a little bit later. There's not that big of a difference between males and females early in childhood. So if you think about birth to up to ages 4, 5, 6-ish, usually there's not a huge difference, and then you start to see a little bit of separation as you get closer and closer to puberty. Females tend to biologically mature faster than males. So the average age for the onset of puberty is 9 years old for females. It's 11 years old for males. Okay, which is why people always like, girls are so much more mature than boys because we had more years. I don't know. Anyways, so there are sex differences. We can also, if we look at height, right? I just showed you that the sigmoid curve pattern, and said that follows the height curve, right? So we can use percentiles as a way to monitor development of height. I had mentioned when I talked about, examples of myself and my sister when we were growing, that she always landed in about the 50th percentile, so that meant she was growing pretty much on the average as compared to other people of her age, versus me, who usually was at a lower percentile because I was shorter than most people my age. But usually you'll see peak velocity of growth for girls at about 11.5 to 12. So you think onset of puberty is at 9, they get their major growth spurt or rapid increases in growth around 11.5 or 12. And that peak velocity is about 8 centimeters per year. For males, they have about 9 centimeters per year as their peak velocity, and this usually occurs at about 13.5 or 14. So relatively the same time period that spans from the onset of puberty, it's about 2 years later that you reach your peak velocity of growth. The end of noticeable growth is going to happen about 3 to 4 years after you hit your peak velocity. So for females, this means they kind of start to taper off at about 14 years, and their end period of growth is at 16. But this is all relative to when puberty begins, because that kind of sets off this rapid growth period. So if you are a late bloomer, like I mentioned I was, that means you hit your growth spurts. All of these things are delayed. So that's why I was saying, generally, that universality concept, we have an idea of how this development will happen for certain age groups, but there could be individual cases where people just develop slower or faster than others. And actually, this is a good tie-in for childhood obesity. That was a big concern. It still is. But I don't know if you guys remembered hearing about this, that children were hitting puberty at earlier ages because of childhood obesity. And I don't remember where I heard this, but I think when you hit like 100 pounds, that's when puberty starts to kick in. And so if you hit 100 pounds late in the game, right, that means onset's going to be later. If you're an obese child, puberty could start earlier. I think I remember there was something in the news about a girl starting puberty at the age of 6 because she was part of the childhood obesity population. So me, on the other hand, I was already small to begin with, but I also danced a lot between the ages of 7 and all the way actually through college. But I think starting around age 9 through age 16, I danced 30 plus hours every single week. So I was very physically active. My energy expenditure was probably far exceeding what I was eating. And oh my God, as a kid, I ate a lot of food, but I was burning all of it through exercise. So if you could think about exercise and the amount of exercise, as well as different dietary factors, could be extrinsic characteristics that could be affecting height or development in height. Well, just some examples that I was thinking of. Weight is very similar to height in the respect that it follows a sigmoid pattern, but weight is very, very susceptible to extrinsic factors. So kind of on the leg of the childhood obesity concept, it very dependent on what you eat and how much energy you expend through exercise. There's also a potential for genetic factors as well, in terms of if you naturally deposit fat more than other people, also where your fat is deposited on your body. So like for my mom and my dad's side of the family, both of their sides tend to gain weight in the hips and thighs, versus I have a friend whose her mom and her dad gain their weight on their chest and like kind of waist up, upper body. So where your fat deposits is more or less a genetically determined factor, but how much is deposited could potentially be genetic, but more largely affected by extrinsic factors such as diet and exercise. The peak velocity of weight gain is going to be pretty similar to height, okay, during adolescence. So it's going to follow peak height by about 3.5 to 10.5 months for females, 2.5 to 5 months for males. So if you think about peak velocity of growth in height was about 2-ish years after the onset of puberty, we're kind of tagging on a few months after that happens for weight. Okay, so we grow vertically and then we grow horizontally, if you want to think about it that way. We also have relative growth that falls under postnatal development. So this is looking at the body as a whole, which pretty much follows a sigmoid pattern, because most physical growth, at least when we talk about physical growth, it's going to be relative to weight and height, which also follow sigmoid curves. Specific body parts and tissues and organs, they all grow at different rates. And then body proportions change in terms of relative growth. So you guys will remember when we talked about babies in our infant lectures, I said, oh, babies have big heads, which is really bad for their center of mass because it makes them fall over all the time if they have a small perturbation up the top of their body. But their head at birth is basically a quarter of their total height, right? 25%. That's crazy. But it's only an eighth of their total height by adulthood. So again, I told you guys the head is the most important part to develop in the prenatal stages because it holds the brain. So the brain pretty much needs to be fully developed by the time birth happens. The rest of the body catches up later. Okay, so the head is one noticeable place of body proportion change, and then the legs are the other noticeable portion of body proportion. Well, poor choice of words. But the legs are usually about 3/8 of the total height, so little less than half at birth, but they're about half of a person's total height at adulthood. Okay, so the legs are going to be a big part of growth spurts during puberty. Yeah, I think that's all I had to say about that. I thought I had a second note, but I guess I don't. All right, so that, in terms of physical growth, those are the patterns that we would notice. In terms of physiological maturation, remember that maturation is referencing the maturity of different body systems, but primarily we're looking at the maturity of the reproductive system or a person's ability to reproduce. And we get hints at physiological maturation when we hit puberty. Indication of maturation status usually is noticeable with secondary sex characteristics. And we call these secondary because the primary sex characteristics are your genitalia, basically determining your biological sex at birth. Secondary sex characteristics are, for the most part, same between males and females, but also slightly different, right? So both males and females end up growing pubic hair, and they also have hormonal changes, obviously. That's the moody teen stigma, right? But females are going to have breast enlargement. They also have menarche, or their first menstrual cycle, and then their pelvis also widens. This is a functional change for preparation for childbirth. If you guys remember your anatomy, the little piece of fibrocartilage that connects the two pelvic bones is called the pubic symphysis. The cartilage actually becomes more lax, and that's how the pelvis widens, right? So your actual bone structure, for the most part, I mean, your bones are growing, but the os coxae, or the pelvic bone, is not, what's it called? It's not a long bone, so it doesn't undergo endochondral ossification. Rather, it has more of a growth in girth, and then we also have the change in the pubic symphysis that allows the widening to happen. For males, on the other hand, instead of breast enlargement, they have enlargement of their testes and scrotum, right, which are going to be where sperm is produced. They also have potential for growing facial hair, where you get like the little awkward mustaches here and there, where it's like not enough facial hair to make something. I'm being mean now, I'm sorry, but you all know what I'm talking about. And then also with enlargement of testes and scrotum, you get gradual production of viable sperm. Viable sperm meaning that the sperm actually works. We get voice changes, so the voice box and Adam's apple kind of become more pronounced, which allows the voice to get deeper. And then males in particular have more muscle growth than females. And that's one part that I feel like is just so unfair, is that women usually increase their fat tissue and men increase their muscular tissue and decrease their fat tissue, which is just rude. But this is largely due to the increase in testosterone, right? Which is something that females don't really experience. We still have testosterone, it's just not as high. But yeah, those are some changes that can be observable directly when puberty hits. We have extrinsic influences on postnatal growth to consider. Pretty much, this is the same things that I've already mentioned, right? Diet and exercise. Diet is probably the most important extrinsic factor throughout the lifespan, just because the nutrients that we put into our body directly affect how our muscles are able to cope with stresses, how our bones are able to cope with stresses if we're going through a growth spurt and we don't have enough calcium for our bones to grow. That's going to affect how much bone we're actually laying down in cartilaginous spaces. We'll talk about endochondral ossification in another week, but like if we don't have enough calcium, then bone growth isn't going to happen as a fast of a rate. If you're eating way too many fatty foods, you're going to deposit that fat in places that's going to directly affect weight. If you eat a lot of protein, but you're also exercising and performing more strength-based stuff, you're going to build more muscle. Everyone knows that muscle metabolizes or increases your metabolism rate, or your words are hard, you guys. Increases your metabolic rate, which in tune is going to help you burn more fat when you're at rest. Diet, huge role. What you put in is kind of what ends up coming out, which is also true with the digestive system, but that's a topic for another day. We also have this thing called catch-up growth, and this is what we refer to as a phenomenon of relatively rapid growth of the body as a recovery of potential growth loss during a period of negative extrinsic influence. So the extent of recovery kind of depends on the timing and duration, as well as the severity of the negative environmental conditions. So if you guys think about the sigmoid curve that we see in terms of growth, right, there's very, very, very rapid increases early on in childhood, as well as in our kind of prenatal stages, but we're talking about postnatal, so after birth, right? But we have this very, very rapid increase up to about early childhood, a relatively steady increase up until the onset of puberty, and then another rapid increase during puberty, followed by a plateau. So typically, if you see any negative extrinsic influences on development during the rapid periods, you're more likely to see catch-up growth later in postnatal development. So you can think about this if a kid, their parents, think of COVID. I think actually this is a perfect example. So parents lose jobs, jobs bring in money. If we don't have as much money, we can't buy food, right? And maybe they go through a nutritional deficit for a period of time because we can't afford to buy food. This is a very real example. But that nutritional deficit, if maybe it happens at a more rapid period of growth, is going to impact development, right? And so let's say parents got their jobs back, right? Income has increased again, and the kid is able to eat at normal amounts again, right? That might influence a catch-up growth period where they're kind of playing catch-up from the time that they lost, right, due to that nutritional deficit. So that's an extrinsic influence on postnatal growth. Exercise, I've already mentioned, right? That's going to have effect on largely muscle mass, right, and strength. But also, exercise has a really, really, really great effect on bone health, which we'll talk about in a few weeks. But the more stress you put on your bones at a younger age, the better you set yourself up for the rest of life. So exercise is going to have a big, big factor on physical growth and the structural integrity of your bones, as well as kind of building your muscular strength. And then metabolism. Okay, that's going to be affected both by genetics, diet, and exercise, which I've kind of commented on throughout the lecture already. Let's say that we've reached our young adulthood, end of puberty phase, and we get into older adulthood and aging. Okay, so changes in growth during adulthood are likely going to be due to the aging of tissues. We still have extrinsic factors that could play a role, but the aging of tissues, we talk about this more again in the coming weeks because that's kind of the part of this whole section. But your height typically remains pretty stable throughout the lifespan, but it's very common for a slight decrease in stature over the adult years. So on the right, I have an example of normal height compared to a person who has osteoporosis, and that's one of the causes for decreases in height. Osteoporosis is an example of a degenerative disease for connective tissue where the articular cartilage wears down, right? We can also have rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune disorder that attacks your cartilage. But if you think about it, your spine, right, has a whole bunch of little fibrocartilage discs between each vertebra. So if your cartilage wears down or ages over time, becomes shrunken or smaller, that's going to reflect changes in height. Osteoporosis or other types of arthritic or bone diseases kind of eat away at bone. Generally, it makes sense that you might get shorter, right? We also have lack of weight-bearing exercise or activity that could lead to decreases in height. So again, this is more of a bone-related thing based on mechanotransduction and not having stressors on the bone to stimulate bone formation. So that could cause decreases in height. And then, like I said, wearing down of articular cartilage between joints. But yeah, osteoporosis is more of a bone degenerative disorder where the rate of bone formation no longer matches the rate of bone absorption. Okay? But like I said, we'll come back to this. In terms of weight, generally you see increases kind of slightly in the early 20s, that freshman 15, right? And then usually weight just fluctuates throughout the lifespan, largely dependent on diet and exercise. Also, extrinsic factor we could think about is global pandemics, where everybody has to stay inside and gyms are shut down, right? You have to get creative. But you could also think about mental status as another example of extrinsic factors. For those of you who get really stressed out or have anxiety or depression, which are two of the most common mental disorders. Many of those can lead to emotional eating, a lack of motivation to move, right? So these mental disorders can affect people, in our age bracket. They could also largely affect people in older age groups. So if you think about older people who get put into rest homes, right, and maybe their family doesn't visit them very often, that could get really depressing, which leads to a decrease in motivation and maybe impacts other types of behavioral characteristics, which means they don't do as much weight-bearing activity, which can cause decreases in height, could cause them to gain weight because their energy expenditure isn't as high as their basal metabolic rate, right? So lots of things to think about that could affect our postnatal development later in the lifespan. Okay, but it's very similar to a lot of the other kind of developmental skills that we've talked about, is that You usually see the biggest development earlier in the lifespan, and then things are a little bit more individually based later. Aging of tissues is inevitable, though. The rate at which the aging occurs, though, could be different depending on the extrinsic factors. So, in summary, right, we have whole body growth follows a sigmoid pattern, right, with rapid increases showing up right after birth as well as during adolescence or puberty. The rate of physiological maturation is going to vary between sexes and individuals, and then genetics play a factor, right? Largely in early development, which is going to kind of predetermine certain characteristics, while extrinsic factors are going to have a larger role later in the lifespan, right? This is not to ignore the fact that extrinsic factors, we're not saying that extrinsic factors don't play a role in prenatal development, but they're more likely to have greater causal effects later in the lifespan.